This short clip isn't some bizarre computer-generated image, but rather an extraction from a short recording of brain signals. The actual length is extended to demonstrate the detail of these recordings, but the core material remains the same. About 10 seconds of data, gathered non-invasively in contact with the scalp, are sent through a program for data processing, and the result is an approximation of what I'm visualizing. In effect, you are seeing a screen recording from my mind's eye. Brain-computer interfacing is rapidly becoming a staple in our age, not just as a sci-fi concept. Brain-computer interfacing can be summarized as any non-analog interaction between a computer and one's own mind, typically to solve an existing problem. In this case, it is the processing of an image from the mind into a digital image, which can be shared with others. The system starts with data acquisition. This is performed through a medical EEG device, namely a KT8-3200. From this, I used 19 data channels as well as a ground and reference electrode. These electrodes are held in place using a 3D printed helmet, using a design off of Thingiverse, project file linked in the description, and an adapter of my own design to fit the product I am using with the modular holes. Fortunately, the helmet becomes a little tight with these adapters, so it is best to pop the back of the helmet so your head can fit. I will likely revise some parts in this design myself, so it works better with these adapters, though, if you would like, I suggest extending the arms at the back piece about 1.5 inches on each side. Placement of electrodes references the International 1020 system, the standard for electrode placement, which is typically used for medical screening and diagnosis, though in truth you could likely get away with less constrained placement if you were to record all the data yourself. I will likely be revising placement myself based on findings towards the end of this project. On the software end, the technology is largely focused on machine learning to find what data in the signal is relevant to the desired data form. It's a boiling down of the contents before forcing them into the desired form. The subject closes their eyes and holds a target image in their head. The recording is taken, and 512 lines of 19 channels are taken through the system and padded. The data is reduced from a state of 8x8 by 256 down to 2x2 by 1024, then further reorganized for the purpose of representing the data form in the form of an image embedding in the size of 4x4 by 512, then finally fed to an image decoder, which represents the data form as a 1024 by 1024 3-channel RGB image, or alternatively a 128 by 128 by 1-channel black and white image, depending on the decoder used. Before any data could be extracted, the first major hurdle presented itself. Though there was a proprietary software, and though it could be extracted into a file which holds the data, the software was first and foremost incredibly slow, and the data output was in the form of XDF, or Extensive Data Format, a defunct but apparently still on occasion used data format, which is typically used for n-dimensional arrays. Using the data is possible here, but in the long run I knew that the ability to cast the data directly and have control over its recording was necessary for the project. So for the first few days I focused on pulling data directly from the device with a custom script. Ultimately, however, the much needed solution was already conducted before me, as this being the cheapest EEG device on the market, someone already hacked the device before me and I was able to use the script as reference for building mine. The reference script is Loud Streaming Layer Compatibility Tool by a certain Alexander Miladinovic. His project will also be found in the description. The major barrier his work got around is that he found the byte encoding for each channel and identified the subsequent commands that are uploaded to the device, which operate as a serial connection. The company itself kept its trade secret, to my knowledge, so kudos to him for besting the thing. Once able to pull the data, it became entirely my own work in processing it. Data processing is done first by making recordings for reference later. A major hiccup in the early stabs at this wasn't how I was processing the data, but how I was recording it. I was initially using a Windows PC and had to go away for a bit, but wished to continue, so I got the same script saved to my laptop, and to my utter shock, I went from sampling 10 samples per second to 200 samples per second, which was a huge boon for my purposes. For early managing of data, a mean is applied every 2 samples. From here we can lay out the major theory. In a large sampling of rippling at the surface of the brain lies information of visualized images, and there is such a way to link this data to a target image. My initial step was to take a generative convolutional neural network directly from the data form to the target image. This was less than ideal and gave little but dark blobs on the screen. I had been searching for a breakthrough when I reached out to a page on Instagram, which works on neural networks professionally, for a new perspective, and he put me on the path of instead reducing it down to clip embeddings, then using a GAN to reproduce it. While dabbling with that and reading the related papers, I happened upon the breakthrough I needed: autoencoders. Embeddings are, in their essence, a compressed data form, which can be understood by a machine with the right decoding method. Thus, the starting point is autoencoders, a type of convolutional neural network which takes the form of an encoder, which takes the data form and reduces it down to a smaller form called a bottleneck, then the decoder, which takes these embeddings and reproduces the original form. Thus, you have part of the model that will in the end reproduce an image already, the image decoder, which takes a small heap of data and reproduces an image from it, building on a dataset of only unpaired images. The next stage is to do the same with EEG data, a model which reduces it, then reassembles it, then a means of going from the form of one embedding to another, which is the model that can be much smaller and more manageable with a limited dataset. For this, I recorded about 1.667 hours of unpaired EEG data, which I was simply freeform visualizing without a target. From there, I recorded a total of 4.1667 hours of targeted visualization data, where I was given a prompt image, then closed my eyes and held the image in my head. This was used to train the last model, which went from embeddings to embeddings. The EEG encoder was trained for 20 cycles through the whole data set with the input data from 512 samples, or about 2.5 seconds, of 19 channels, which is then padded into an 8x8 by 256 data form with 2 samples in each 8x8 patch, then convoluted down to 2x2 by 1024, reducing from 9,728 data points to 4096. The image decoder moves from 4x4 by 512 data form, so it is needed in the embedding converter to convolute transpose up to that form. Thus, we define the embedding converter as a neural network which takes an input data form of 2x2 by 1024 size it up to 4x4 by 2048, then implement a hidden layer which sizes it up once more in order to manage all of the connections needed to go from one embedding to the other. Thus, the input is the EEG embeddings, taken by feeding the EEG data to a frozen EEG encoder, taking that and passing it to the embeddings converter, then comparing it to the image embeddings, which we pre-save using the image encoder. From here, the next training script is defined. What we want is to train both the EEG encoder and the embeddings converter beyond just the baseline. We want the encoder to favor data which corresponds to the image, rather than everything else which may be going on through the mind at the time. So the script trains the encoder and the embeddings converter to take the data from the EEG source all the way to the image embeddings. One mistake I made early on was not using dropouts. The power of dropouts is that it convinces the network that it can't always trust nodes for data because it has a small chance it is set to 0 by default. So it instead forms an excess of connections both ways to compensate for its uncertainty. The majority of the time training for the system was spent on the accurately named micromanage script, which was responsible for overseeing the filtering and structuring of data from start to finish, and by the time of recording, it had been run for 100 cycles through the data. The data can then be taken from start to finish by first sending it through the EEG encoder, then the embeddings converter, and finally the image decoder, which I made both a 128 by 128 monochromatic form and a 1024 by 1024 RGB form, both using the same embeddings. The 128 by 128 monochromatic favors speed and is less prone to lessons on the images, but the RGB decoder grants a lot clearer images most of the time. So this whole project was a headache and a half, and I likely neared losing my mind a few times during the investment into it. So the natural question is, why? What use is a machine that can see what you visualize? Well, there are several applications which present themselves, aside from being fascinated with the work of the psychologist Jung and his concept of active imagining, which could be recorded with more refined form of the system. It also acts as a form of media creation, or simply quick rendering of references for art. But in truth, my interest lies a little deeper than that. As those from my Instagram page, total_desolation, well know, I have a bit of a fascination with recording dreams in the form of written descriptions. This has never sat right with me, so I define the artist dilemma. One is made to watch and perceive a visionary world with the audience of one. The desire is to show others, tell them of this world, but no medium truly replicates it. So my goal in starting this project has truly been pursuit of a device which will record dreams. The recording of visualized images is the first step. Moving forward, there are several flaws which I can address. The first that comes to mind is the phenomenon of focus-based cropping. The reference images actually have some border which is cropped out in the image generated from the recording. This indicates the system's tendency to cut the uncertain borders, and though I don't know for certain if it originates in the brain or the system, I do have a solution. As it does crop the uncertainty, the solution would be to pre-crop training data based on where attention is placed on the image. It just so happens that while I visualize the images, I tend to move my eyes around the image in my mind, and this does take the form of rolling beneath my eyelids. While it is happening, there also happens to be a device recording the electrical activity a small distance above my eyes. International 1020 system, 2 electrodes are often used to detect rapid eye movement, which I do include in the recordings. Thus, I can detect where the eyes are focused by linking those electrodes to a much smaller system of eye tracking. Then the script would crop the image accordingly prior to the image embedding being taken. Now, one more limitation I've had is the computer I'm using. I likely cannot pull off the system in any reasonable timeline, simply because training neural networks is such a slog on resources. Technology is advancing the field of training neural networks, so an investment in a computer that can handle that kind of demand, as well as the demand of a model that is larger and more robust, is necessary if I want to reach the point of recording dreams, which will include both video and audio. Furthermore, there are major hardware upgrades I can make to the system itself, which could make a reasonable product. Perhaps you, too, will one day be able to record your dreams simply by plugging in a device and wearing a cap to sleep. This approach operates as not only the niche use case of recording visualized images, but also other data forms, such as audio. I've not yet built such a system, but it is on my list, as well as one that simply uses one's eyes as a camera, simply because it can be useful later. If you would like to see that and other videos about tech, obsessive hacking of hardware, and machine learning applications, be sure to like, subscribe, and if you truly enjoyed, please share the video with others, and financial support is deeply appreciated. Find sources in the description. Hey, I have one more treat for you. I was asked recently why use the whole brain as a reference when the visual cortex is central to seeing. I answered originally with the fact that it's a distributed process and touches multiple regions, starting wherever consciousness resides, then being drawn out from the darkness by the parietal lobe, processed by the visual cortex before finally being sent to the conscious attention. But the question got to me, wondering about where the system was actually getting the data. So I referenced the International 1020 system and a map of the brain to identify which electrodes corresponded to each major lobe of the brain, and selectively eliminated lobes to determine which was the most important to the output by comparing the results of the same sample being sent through with different regions blocked. I was shocked to find the frontal lobe was a far greater source of the data than the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe combined, with the temporal lobe offering little to no usable data. Thus, from this information, we can conclude that the frontal lobe is more important than any other part of the brain in generating or observing a visualized image.